My name is Seraphina Thornvale. I am 31 years old. I'm a hospice nurse at Cedarwood Palliative Care Center in Portland, Oregon. I work the night shift, mostly. I have held the hands of dying strangers in the dark more times than I can count. I have watched people take their last breath while their families slept in waiting room chairs down the hall, too exhausted to stay awake for the thing they had driven 4 hours to be present for. I have gotten very good at staying calm in rooms where everything else is falling apart. That is not a boast. It is just what the job made me. 2 weeks ago, I walked into a patient's room on the night shift and I was not calm. I stood in the doorway of room 9A with an intake clipboard in my left hand and a pen in my right, and the fluorescent in the hallway behind me was doing its usual flat hum, and the IV stand beside the bed was doing its usual soft, rhythmic beep, and everything in that room was exactly the way it always is at Cedarwood, quiet and dim and arranged for leaving. I have walked into hundreds of rooms exactly like it. I know what they smell like. I know what the air feels like. I know where to put my weight when I move so the floor doesn't creak and disturb a patient who has finally got to sleep. And then I looked at the name on the patient's intake bracelet, 7 letters. Printed in standard black hospital ink, the same font on every bracelet in the building, the same size, the same ordinary weight. I read them once. Then I read them again. My pen stopped moving in the middle of making a note. My breathing changed, not dramatically, not visibly, just the quiet internal shift of a body recognizing something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. My brain, the same brain I have trained for 7 years to stay level in emergencies, in the middle of grief, in the specific silence that comes just after a heart monitor flatlines, did something I have never felt it do before in my professional life. It simply stopped. Like a piece of machinery that has hit an obstacle it was not built to process. I stood in that doorway for 11 seconds. I counted. Counting is what I do when my body wants to do something my training won't allow. 11 seconds of standing completely still in a quiet room with an IV beeping and a man sleeping. The man lying in that bed was my father. His name was Fletcher Voss. He was 63 years old. He had terminal liver failure. He had been transferred from a care facility in Bend, Oregon, 2 days before, with a prognosis of approximately 2 weeks. He was listed on his intake form as having no next of kin, no emergency contact, no family visitors expected. And he was the only person I had spent my entire adult life learning to hate. I want to be careful about the word hate. I know it is a strong word. I know people use it loosely, in the way they say they hate traffic or hate a certain song. This was not that kind of hate. This was the other kind, the kind that becomes structural. The kind you build yourself around so gradually that by the time you are 31 years old, you cannot entirely separate it from who you are. It had become, over 22 years, less like a feeling and more like a foundation. Everything I was rested on it in some way. Every wall I had built pointed back to it. Fletcher Voss had 2 weeks left to live. I was the nurse assigned to help him through them. And he had no idea who I was. Here is what I need you to understand before I take you to the beginning of this story. I carried that hatred for 22 years because I believed I had reason to. I was 9 years old when my mother sat my sister and me down at the kitchen table and told us our father had chosen another woman over his family, that he had taken money and left and was not coming back. I believed her. I believed her the way a 9-year-old believes the person who has always been the center of their known world. Completely, without any gaps, that belief became the architecture of my life. It explained everything. It excused the walls. It justified the distance I kept from people who wanted to be close. It gave purpose to a career built around staying for strangers. Because if the people you were supposed to love would leave you, the only safe thing to do was love carefully and at great distance, and give the rest of yourself to people who needed you but couldn't hurt you by going. I thought I was healing something. I thought the work was the answer. I was wrong about everything. But I didn't know that yet. I just knew his name on a bracelet. I just knew his hands, a carpenter's hands, thick at the knuckles, rough at the palm, resting on the white hospital blanket. I just knew that I had stood in a doorway for 11 seconds and that my hands were not shaking when they should have been, because shaking would have meant I still cared, and I had decided at 9 years old that I did not. Before I take you into this story, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. I mean that. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to know, now let me take you back. To the kitchen, to the wobbly table, to the Tuesday that built me. And then, piece by piece, letter by letter, night by night, to everything that took that building down. The apartment in Salem, Oregon had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a broken light above the stove that my mother never replaced, and a living room window that faced the street. I was 9 years old. My sister Naira was 6. She had a habit at that age of carrying one of her shoes in her hand instead of wearing it, and she had done that all the way home from school that Tuesday afternoon, so one of her socks had gone gray at the heel from the sidewalk by the time we got inside. I remember that detail with complete clarity. I remember it because I kept looking at her gray-heeled sock during the conversation instead of my mother's face. It was easier to look at the sock. Vivienne Thornvale, our mother, sat us down at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock that Tuesday evening in October. The table had a wobbly leg on the left side. She had never fixed it. She sat on the right side, where it was stable, and she folded her hands in front of her and she looked at us with her chin slightly raised and her eyes completely dry. She told us our father had been seeing another woman for some time. She told us he had taken money from their shared savings account in the weeks before leaving. She told us he had gone, and that he was not coming back. She said it in 3 clean sentences, the way Vivienne says most hard things, with precision, without decoration, as if the directness itself was a form of strength. She did not cry. That was the detail that reached in and rearranged something permanent in me. My mother, who was not a cold woman who made soup from scratch when we were sick and sang off-key to the radio on Saturday mornings, sat at that table and told us our father was gone and her eyes were completely dry. No trembling at the edges. No pausing to press her fingers to her mouth. Nothing. And then she said, "We don't need him, Seraphina, we never did." I believed her. The way you believe a load-bearing wall, without question because the whole structure depends on it, Naira cried. Naira is 6 years old, and crying is the correct response to being told your father is not coming back, and she pressed herself against the window that faced the street and watched the road for a long time that night, as if she thought headlights might still appear. As if the story might still reverse itself. I sat at the kitchen table, and I watched my mother's face instead of the window, and I made the decision that 9-year-olds sometimes make, the kind that settle into the bones and don't leave. I decided that composure was the only armor worth wearing. That caring too much for specific people was how you got broken. That if I was going to be someone who stayed, I would stay for everyone and no one in particular, and that way nothing could be taken specifically from me. Later that same night, my mother went to the hall closet and pulled out a set of woodworking tools that had been sitting there since Fletcher's last visit. A hand plane, a set of chisels, 2 wood rasps, a marking gauge. She put them in a black garbage bag without ceremony and set the bag by the front door. I watched her do all of this in complete silence. She never looked at me while she did it. In the morning, the bag was gone. Years later, much later, I would think about those tools. About the fact that a man who had a set of woodworking tools stored in his ex-wife's hall closet was a man who expected to come back. You don't leave your tools somewhere you don't plan to return to. But I didn't think about that at 9. I just watched them disappear into a garbage bag and filed it under. He left nothing behind worth keeping. I became a hospice nurse because of that Tuesday. Not immediately, not in a direct, conscious line. But the choice grew from that kitchen the way most deep choices do, slowly and invisibly, until one day it was simply who I was. I understood early that people leave. They always, eventually, leave. I wanted to be the one who stayed, even when staying was the hardest thing in the room. Every patient I have ever sat with at 4 in the morning, every hand held in the dark, every family I have gently and truthfully prepared for what is coming, all of it was rooted in that night. In the need to be the constant when everything else was motion. In nursing school, I shared an apartment with a woman named Callista Ashbourne. She was sharp and funny and asked questions most people didn't think to ask. One afternoon, when we were in our 2nd year, she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Why palliative specifically? You have the scores for any department." I said, "Because dying patients need someone who knows how to stay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently, "Or maybe because you know they can't leave first." I told her she was wrong. I went back to studying. But the sentence stayed with me the way the sentences you argue against always stay, because some part of you already knows they have found something real. I built my whole identity around the belief that I knew exactly what a selfish man looked like. I had one as a reference. I wore that knowledge the way some people wear a first-place ribbon, as proof of something, as evidence of having survived the thing that would have unmade someone smaller. I never questioned the story. Not once. In 22 years, I did not ask a single question. The night before the shift that changed everything, I ate cereal over my kitchen sink and watched the lights on level 3 of the parking garage across the street flicker on and off, on and off. I thought about calling Naira. She is still in Salem, still 3 years younger, still laughing too loudly at everything and crying at television commercials about dogs. I decided not to. I rinsed the bowl and set it in the drying rack and went to bed at 11. I set my alarm for 6:15. I had a shift starting at 7. I had no idea what was waiting for me in 14 hours. The shift board at Cedarwood runs along the east wall of the nurses' station, updated every morning by the charge nurse, Myrle Vailcrest, who has been at this facility for 11 years and keeps the board in a handwriting so precise it looks printed. I check it at the start of every night shift the same way. I run my finger down the patient roster, noting transitions in care level, changes in medication, the departure of anyone who did not make it through the day shift. Most of the names that week were familiar. Most of them had been with us for weeks. New admission. Room 9A terminal liver failure. Transferred from a care facility in Bend, Oregon. Admitted earlier that afternoon. The name listed beside the room number was Fletcher Voss. I read it twice. Then a third time the way you reread a word when it has suddenly lost its shape and become just letters. My finger stayed on the board. Behind me, the station maintained its usual quiet rhythm, the tick of keyboards, the soft roll of a desk chair, an overhead page calling someone to the second floor. The charge nurse was on the phone. Nobody was looking at me. I counted to 11. Then I picked up his intake clipboard from the tray and walked down the corridor to room 9AHE, was thinner than the picture I had carried in my head for 22 years. That picture, which I had constructed more from imagination than from actual memory, given that I was 9 years old the last time I saw him, showed a larger man, a presence that filled a doorframe. The man in bed 9A had gone narrow. His face was hollowed a little along the jaw. His hair, which I had always remembered as dark brown, was silver all the way through, cut short and lying flat in the way of a man who no longer spends much thought on it. His hands were on top of the white blanket at his sides. And those I recognized. Not from a photograph, not from a constructed memory. Just from the simple fact that some things are carried in the body regardless of 22 years of effort. A carpenter's hands. Wide at the knuckle, rough-skinned, with the kind of wear that doesn't come from a few months of use but from decades. Hands that had built things, taken things apart, built them again. Those hands were the only part of him that matched anything I had been carrying. He looked up when I came in. His eyes were gray. I had not remembered that, or maybe I had never known it. "Good evening," I said. 7 years of practice inside those 3 syllables. Steady, warm, professional. "Evening," he said. His voice was quieter than I expected and slightly hoarse, the particular roughness of someone who has not had many visitors to talk to. He tracked my movements with the careful attention of a man who had spent enough time in hospitals to understand what each motion meant. He did not know who I was. My badge read Thornvale, my mother's name, the name she had given both of us after he was gone. To Fletcher Voss, I was the night nurse. The woman in scrubs who would check his vitals and adjust his drip rate and ask about his pain level. No more and no less, I asked his pain level. He said 4. I adjusted the IV drip. I noted his oxygen saturation. I checked the call button was within reach and asked if he wanted the overhead light brought down further. He said yes, please. All of it was correct. All of it was precise. My hands moved through the familiar sequence and did not pause and did not shake. I was furious at myself, quietly and privately, that my hands did not shake. Because shaking would have been evidence of something. It would have meant that 22 years of practiced indifference had not entirely taken hold. And my hands were completely steady, which meant either that the work had done what I trained it to do, or that something in me had gone so still it was beyond shaking. I couldn't tell in that moment which one it was. At the door, turning to leave, I heard him. "Thank you." Words. "Quiet," said the way a man says it when he means it genuinely, but has too little energy left for elaboration. I stopped moving for just a moment, not visibly, not long enough for anyone watching to notice. Just a pause, like a breath between sentences. Then I kept walking. The social worker was at the nurse's station. When I came out of 9A, his name was Cale Ashbourne. I had seen him around Cedarwood before. He ran a weekly outreach program, the kind that checked in on long-term patients who had no regular family visitors, patients who were in the process of dying without anyone to track that process with them. He was mid-30s, unhurried in the way of a person who has made peace with the fact that the world will not slow down for him, but has decided not to match its pace anyway. He had warm eyes and the habit of leaning against counters instead of standing straight at them. He looked at me when I came out of 9A, something adjusted in his expression, subtle, not dramatic. The kind of shift a person makes when they notice something they were not prepared to notice. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the slight pause before he turned back to his notes, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached toward the break room and handed me a coffee. I had not asked for one, had not said a single word indicating I needed one, and went back to what he was doing. That was the entirety of our first conversation. I carried it home with me anyway. I don't know exactly why. I sat in the Cedarwood parking lot at 7:15 in the morning, while the sun came up gray and flat over the edges of the city, and I thought about those two words, fine, and the pause that followed them, and what it meant that a person I had spoken 4 sentences to had read me more accurately in 40 seconds than most people managed in months. I called Naira. It went to voicemail. I sat for another few minutes. Then I drove home. I lay on my bed fully dressed, still in my scrubs, and I stared at the ceiling and I felt something I hadn't felt in 22 years. Something I didn't immediately have a name for. Not grief, not anger, both of those were familiar and I knew their shapes. Something underneath both of them. Something older and less organized. Uncertainty. A hairline crack in a wall you built to last. Third night. Cale was waiting in the corridor outside room 9A before my shift began. He was holding a manila folder, not thick, maybe 20 pages, the edges slightly worn in the way of something that has been opened and closed many times. He did not offer it to me immediately. He stood in the corridor with it at his side and said, "Can I have 5 minutes before you go in?" I said yes. We walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looks out over the side parking lot and a low strip of city beyond it. He leaned against the wall beside the window. I stood with my arms crossed and my shoulder blades against the cool glass and waited. "Known Fletcher Voss for 3 years," he said. "Since he first came into the outreach program. I visit him weekly, or I did, when he was at the Bend facility. I know his history well." He paused. His history includes 2 daughters in Salem, Oregon. Daughters he spent years trying to reach after their mother filed a restraining order against him in 2003. He talked about them a lot in our sessions. He never stopped hoping they'd find each other somehow. Parking lot below was quiet. A car pulled in slowly. I watched it park. "First night," Cale said. "When I saw your name badge, Thornvale, I recognized it from his file. He still lists both daughters by their mother's name, the name she gave them. He updated the file himself, years ago, because he figured that was the name you'd be using." He looked at me steadily. "I waited 2 days before saying anything, not to protect him, to give you time to be ready." He held the folder out. I took it. The first document inside was a restraining order, filed by Vivienne Thornvale in October 2003. It cited emotional instability and erratic behavior, and a series of alleged threats that were described in the careful, formatted language that court documents use, language designed to make things sound established when they are merely alleged. I read through the allegations once, then went back and read more carefully, looking for dates, for specifics, for the kind of detail that sticks because it is remembered rather than constructed. The specifics were thin. They were the kind of thin that trained eyes notice. Behind the restraining order was Fletcher's attorney's response. It was thorough in a way that conveyed both genuine indignation and careful preparation. It addressed each allegation by name and provided a counteraccount for every incident Vivienne had described. Behind the response, testimony letters. 3 neighbors, signed and notarized. His employer at a cabinetry firm in Salem, who had known him for 9 years. Not a single one of Vivienne's allegations had been substantiated. Not one ever went before a judge with evidence attached to it. The restraining order had been granted on application, which is how emergency restraining orders often work, and was never challenged in a full hearing, because by the time the hearing date arrived, Vivienne had relocated her daughters across state lines without court notification, and the logistics of the case had become more complicated than Fletcher's resources, at that moment, could manage. I turned to the next section. Court petitions. 3 of them. Fletcher Voss filing for visitation rights in 2004. Again in 2006. Again in 2009. Each one delayed, complicated, ultimately unsuccessful, partly because of the restraining order, partly because of the relocation issue, partly because of the particular cruelty of family court timelines when money is limited on one side and determination is limited on the other. 3 times he had tried. Over 9 years. With lawyers he had to pay for out of a cabinetry worker's salary. I was still reading. My face was still controlled the way I had trained it to be controlled. Cale was quiet beside me, not the silence of someone performing patience. The silence of someone who has already grieved something at length and has learned that other people's grief does not require his commentary. Then I got to the last section of the folder. I already knew what it was before I turned to it. Not because I am particularly perceptive, because some information announces itself before it arrives. Some truths send a low, vibrating hum ahead of themselves, and the part of you that knows how to listen for what people don't say picks it up before the words do. Letters. Fletcher's copies. He had kept copies of letters sent to our Salem address. The letters were dated. They began in 1995, the year my mother moved us away, and they continued 1 or 2 a year until 2011. 16 years. The folder held copies of 23 letters. Every single one was marked return to sender. The handwriting on the stamps was neat and upright and precise. It had a particular habit of making its capital letters slightly larger than necessary, as if asserting something. I had grown up watching that handwriting. I had watched it sign permission slips for field trips, address envelopes for birthday cards, write grocery lists in careful, organized columns. I closed the folder, Cale said. I'm not telling you he was a perfect man. I'm telling you the story you were given had a very specific author. I stood at that window for a moment. My reflection was faint in the glass against the dark parking lot, a woman in scrubs holding a manila folder, looking like what I was. Then I said very quietly, "Where are the actual letters?" Cale said. "What do you mean?" "The originals, not his copies, the ones she sent back. Where are they?" He looked at me carefully. He didn't answer. Because we both already understood that I wasn't asking him, I walked into room 9A and I did my job. Fletcher was awake and comfortable, and he thanked me quietly when I brought his evening medications, and I checked his vitals and adjusted his position and noted his fluid levels on the chart. He watched me work with that same careful, patient attention. He still didn't know. I pulled the chair slightly closer to his bed than protocol requires when I sat down to update his notes. Just slightly. An inch, maybe 2. No one watching would have noticed. It cost me something to do it. I did it anyway. 6 in the morning. I was in the Cedarwood parking lot in my car with the engine off and the windows fogged. I called Naira. This time she picked up on the second ring. She answered with the bright, slightly sleepy noise she always makes when she picks up somewhere between a greeting and a yawn, reaching for conversation before she is entirely awake. I did not ease into it. There is no gentle on-ramp for what I needed to say, and trying to build one would have been a way of protecting myself from having to say it out loud, which was not something I was willing to do. I told her everything. I told her about the intake board and the name that stopped me, about Fletcher's silver hair and his carpenter's hands on the white blanket, about standing in the doorway for 11 seconds, about Cale Ashbourne and the manila folder and every document inside it, the restraining order, the 3 visitation petitions, the testimony letters, the copies of 23 letters that had been sent and returned unopened over 16 years. I told her about the handwriting on the return to sender stamps. I tracked Naira's silences the way you track vital signs when you're not sure what you're looking for. 3 seconds when I mentioned the restraining order. 5 seconds when I described the petitions. 7 seconds, the longest, when I told her about the handwriting on the stamps. Naira, who deals with most of life's difficulties by producing a great deal of noise, who laughs until she cries and cries at television commercials about dogs, did not make a sound during those silences. When she finally spoke, her voice was something I had never heard from her before. It was flat in the center, the way a voice sounds when something essential has been removed from it. "Mom told me he never wrote," she said. "Not once, not one letter, not one phone call. She said he was gone and he stayed gone." I let that sit between us. "Naira," I said, "I need to ask you something." She waited. When Mom moved in 2019, you helped her pack the attic. Do you remember a box? Fireproof, document box, the kind with a small key. The silence this time was different from the others. Slower. Like something rising. She said it was tax records, Naira said. Do you remember where she put it in the new house? I know exactly where it is, Naira said. And her voice, when she said it, had gone very still. Naira drove to our mother's house that morning under the pretense of returning a casserole dish she had borrowed 3 weeks earlier and had been meaning to bring back. Our mother, Vivienne, who had been remarried for 14 years to a quiet, garden-obsessed man named Gerald Whitmore, was at her Saturday book club until noon. The house was empty. Naira had the key, which Vivienne had given her years ago for emergencies. Naira found the box in the attic exactly where she remembered it. She called me back 40 minutes after we hung up. The sound of her voice in that second phone call is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was not loud or broken or sharp. It was completely, absolutely still, the specific stillness of someone holding something they have no existing category for and cannot yet decide what to do with. The box contained every letter Fletcher Voss had ever sent to our Salem address, every one of them unopened, still sealed. Some of the envelopes had yellowed slightly at the corners. Some of the stamps were from the mid-90s, those slightly faded colors from before the post office changed the design. 16 years of letters, bundled in rubber bands by year and stacked in the order they had arrived. He had sent 2 a year for the first 5 years, from the looks of it, 1 a year after that. The last bundle was dated 2011, when Naira was about to turn 19. Every envelope had been marked return to sender in our mother's handwriting. Every envelope was sealed. She had never opened them before sending them back. She had simply marked them and returned them, year after year, and then, when she moved in 2019, she had packed them into a fireproof box and carried them across the city into her new attic and told her daughter they were tax records and instructed her not to open them. She kept them. That is the detail I keep returning to, even now. She did not burn them. She did not throw them away. She stored them in a fireproof box, a box specifically designed to survive a fire, a flood, a disaster, and she moved them twice in 22 years. She kept them with the specific care you give to things that matter. She kept them, which means every single year, when the next letter arrived, she knew. She saw the envelope. She saw his handwriting. She stamped it and sent it back, and then she filed it with the others, and she said nothing, and she kept going. And when the letters finally stopped coming, sometime around 2011, she kept the box anyway. I sat on the curb outside Cedarwood that morning in my scrubs as the day's shift began arriving around me. My colleague Leora Moonville came out on her way to her car and looked at me for a moment. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just sat down on the curb beside me, right there on the concrete in her coat and her bag over her shoulder, and she didn't say anything, just sat. Sometimes that is exactly what care looks like. No words, no questions, just the presence of another person who has looked at you and decided that what you need is not a solution but a witness. We sat there for a few minutes. Then she patted my shoulder once and got up and went to her car. I stayed on the curb for a while longer, watching the cars pull in and out, watching the morning happen around me. I was trying to locate, inside myself, the shape of what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly anger, though there was anger in it. It wasn't grief, though grief was somewhere in it too. It was something underneath those, something older and more foundational. It was the specific vertigo of standing at the edge of a story you have lived inside for your whole adult life and realizing it was built on a room that doesn't exist. The night he knew Night 7. Fletcher's condition had been shifting across the week in the way it shifts near the end, clarity arriving and receding without any predictable schedule, like a radio signal that sharpens briefly before dissolving back into static. On some nights he was fully present, speaking carefully and completely, asking measured questions about his medications and what was coming. On other nights he was somewhere I couldn't follow, working through something behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the room he was in. Hospice nurses learn to be ready for both versions. You don't know, walking through the door, which one you'll find. You adjust as you go. That night I was updating his chart at the small desk beside his bed. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet after 10 at night in a care facility, a genuine quiet, not the suppressed kind. The lamp on the bedside table was on its lowest setting. The IV stand beeped its soft, regular rhythm. Outside, a fine November rain was moving against the window, the kind Portland produces for weeks at a stretch without drama, just a constant, patient presence. I thought he was asleep. He said my name, not nurse, not miss. He said Seraphina. Clearly and with a particular care in the pronunciation, like someone saying a word they have been holding in their mouth for a long time and have decided they are finally going to let out. I put the chart down. I looked at him. He was looking at me. And something in his face had clarified in the low light. The particular sharpening of a dying man whose body is resting but whose attention has suddenly found exactly what it was looking for. The look of recognition. Not confusion. Not a question. Recognition. The thing a father carries in his face when he finally finds his daughter's eyes. I did not correct him. I did not tell him he was confused, that I was only the nurse, that he should rest. I did not reach for the professional armor I have worn since I was 9 years old. I simply stayed where I was. He didn't apologize. There was no apology speech, no listing of reasons and defenses and explanations. He was too tired for all of that, and somewhere in the room we both understood that the time for the longer version had already passed. Some things can only happen in the time that's left, which means they have to happen simply and directly and without the scaffolding. He looked at me and said, I looked for you in every room I walked into for 20 years. I said, I know, I found the letters. Something moved across his face. Not relief, exactly, something quieter than relief, something that had been waiting longer. The expression of a person who has been holding a door open for so long that their arm had forgotten it could lower. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked about Naira. Not whether she was okay, not whether she knew, just whether she was happy. I told him she laughed too loudly and cried at television commercials about dogs. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved. We talked in the way you talk when the time for the whole version has already passed, in pieces, in fragments, in the small particular details that stand in for the larger ones. What Salem looked like now. What Portland was like in winter. Whether I liked my work. He told me about a cherry wood dining table he had spent 6 months building for a couple in Bend who had cried when they saw it finished. He told me he had moved back to Oregon 7 years ago. I asked why. He said, because I wanted to be in the same state, just in case. I sat with that for a long time. The idea of someone spending 7 years in the same state as someone who didn't know they existed, not imposing, not pressing, just near, just in case. I had been 9 years old the last time I thought of him as a person who wanted to be near. Something in the chest does a very specific thing when you confront the gap between the person you were told someone was and the person they actually are. It is not comfortable, but it is real in a way that discomfort sometimes is. He asked me about the box. The cedar jewelry box on his bedside table unfinished, its joints solid but its surface still rough-sanded, the lid not yet fitted. He had been building it in Bend, at the workshop the facility there kept for patients well enough to use it. He had the pencil sketches in the drawer, the plans for the lid, the dimensions, the placement of the small brass hinge. He pulled the drawer open and handed me the sketch carefully. Then he asked if I would finish it. I looked at the sketch for a long time. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I folded the paper along its existing crease and held it. He didn't push. He had learned, apparently, how not to push. Cale was in the corridor when I came out of 9A at 4 in the morning. He was not scheduled to be there at 4 in the morning. He offered no explanation for why he was, and I didn't ask. He simply handed me a coffee and walked with me to the window at the end of the hall, the same window where 3 nights ago he had handed me a folder that had taken something I thought was permanent and quietly, systematically dismantled it. We stood at the window. The city below was at that specific 4 in the morning quiet, a settled, held-breath quiet that exists in the space between the night's last activity and the morning's first. A few streetlights. A delivery truck moving slowly 3 blocks away. The rain was still going, I said. How do you do this job without it hollowing you out? Cale was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. He takes questions seriously, which is something I had noticed and catalogued without meaning to. Then he said, I let it fill me instead, takes practice. I looked at him. He was looking at the city. He had the particular stillness of a person who has not constructed their calm as a performance, but simply arrived at it through repeated effort and decided it was worth keeping. It was different from my stillness. Mine had always been armor. His was something else, something more like ground. I decided very quietly, without saying anything about it, that I wanted to know this person for a long time. I drove to Salem at sunrise. I had not called ahead. I had not planned what I was going to say. I parked in front of my mother's colonial house. The white shutters, the manicured front lawn, the scripture sign above the door that she had hung there the year she married Gerald. And I sat in the car and I counted to 4 minutes. Then I got out. Gerald Whitmore was in the garden when I arrived. He is a soft-spoken man who has spent 14 years being married to someone who manages the interior of a life the way she manages a kitchen, organized, controlled, nothing out of its assigned place. He has never, to my knowledge, asked a hard question. He waved at me with easy warmth from behind the low garden wall, and I waved back and went inside. My mother was in the kitchen. She was making tea, the loose-leaf kind she has always made, with the small ceramic strainer and the particular precision of someone for whom even morning tea is a controlled procedure. She had her back to me when I walked in, and she turned with the mild, managed surprise of someone who was not entirely shocked but had not known the exact timing. She looked at me with her chin slightly raised, her eyes calm, her hands already reaching for a second cup. "Seraphina," she said, "I didn't know you were coming." "I know," I said. She finished making the tea. She set a cup in front of me at the kitchen table, not the wobbly one from Salem. This was a newer, sturdier table, but she sat on the same side and folded her hands in front of her in the same exact posture she had held on the Tuesday night 31 years ago. I noticed that. I noticed it and did not comment on it. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. The entire conversation was conducted at conversation level. Ordinary, quiet, the kind of volume you use when you are discussing something that doesn't require performance because the weight of it is already self-evident. I have found, in 7 years of delivering hard news to families, that the quieter you are, the more clearly people hear you. I laid it out item by item. The way I would present a patient's case history to a consulting physician, methodically, in order, without interpretation until the facts were fully on the table. The restraining order filed in October 2003. The allegations that were never substantiated. The attorney's response and the neighbor testimony. The 3 visitation petitions filed in 2004, 2006, and 2009. Each one. The relocation across state lines without court notification. The 16 years of letters sent and returned. And the box. The fireproof box in her attic, still there, still sealed, carrying 22 years of proof that she had known, every single year, that he was still trying. My mother's face did not change during most of this. She has extraordinary control of her face. It is one of the things I have always admired in her, and one of the things I have always been most afraid of inheriting. But when I mentioned the box, the specific detail of the fireproof box, the fact that it had survived 2 moves in 14 years and was still sitting in her attic in the new house, something moved underneath the surface. Just for a moment, just a flicker of something she had not prepared a response for, then her face was still again. "I protected you," she said. "From what?" I said. "From letters." From a man who filed 3 separate visitation petitions and hired a lawyer each time and still didn't stop trying. "What exactly were you protecting us from?" she said. He wasn't stable." "There's no evidence of that," I said. "Not from the court, not from his neighbors who knew him for years, not from his employer. The allegations in the restraining order were unsubstantiated, and you know that because you wrote them." I watched her absorb that sentence. "There was no other woman," I said. Not loudly, not as an accusation exactly, more as a fact that had been waiting 22 years to be said in this room. That was the piece everything else was built on, and it wasn't true. And at some point, somewhere in the last 2 decades, you knew that. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Gerald was still in the garden. I could hear the faint sound of him moving something, the scrape of a tool on stone. My mother's face did the thing I described as dissolving. I don't mean she broke down, she didn't. Vivienne Thornvale Whitmore does not break down in front of people. What I mean is that the architecture of the expression she maintained gave way, layer by careful layer. The way a building doesn't collapse dramatically, but instead simply becomes what it always was underneath the facade. Smaller and older, and without the supplementary structures that made it look larger than it was. What was underneath was not the villain I had spent 22 years building in my mind. Villains are easier. What was underneath was a woman who had been very, very afraid of being left, who had watched her marriage unraveling and had decided, before it could happen to her, before she could be the one standing on the wrong end of a closed door, to be the one who closed it first, who had constructed a story that made her a victim of abandonment rather than the author of it, and who had then spent 22 years maintaining that story because looking at her daughters and telling them the truth had always been more than she could bear to face. I asked about the box. Specifically, I asked why she had kept the letters. She was silent for a long time. Gerald's garden sounds came through the window. The kitchen light was the same flat overhead light as always. Finally, she said, because throwing them away would have meant admitting he was real. I sat with that. She meant it as an explanation. And in its way, it was one. A man who no longer wrote could be turned into an absence, a gap, a silence, something that had never existed enough to matter. A man who kept writing was real and specific and persistent. A man who wrote for 16 years and kept copies and hired lawyers 3 times was a man whose existence contradicted the entire story she had constructed. Keeping the letters in a sealed box was a way of controlling both realities at once, acknowledging his existence privately, denying it publicly, and never having to choose between them. I opened my bag. I placed a single document on the kitchen table between us. It was a notarized copy of Naira's written account of finding the box, prepared with the help of a legal contact of Kale's who had done the paperwork on short notice and without fanfare, along with a formal letter from Cedarwood identifying me as a family member currently participating in Fletcher's care. I told my mother that Fletcher's obituary, when it came, would name both his daughters. That the people in his life, the colleagues, the neighbors, the members of his community in Bend who had watched him search for years, would know his story. That I was not threatening legal action. I was not interested in courts or filings or formal proceedings. What I was doing was removing her ability to control the narrative. For 22 years, the only people who knew the real version of this story were Vivienne and Fletcher. Fletcher could not tell it because no one who needed to hear it was listening. Vivienne could manage it because she was the one who held the original documents and sat in the room where the story began. What I was doing with that single piece of paper on the kitchen table was taking the story back, not for revenge, not to punish her, but because the story belonged to the people whose lives it had shaped and those people had a right to it. You built a story, I said. I'm returning it to the people it belongs to. I picked up my bag. I stood. My mother stayed at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her face that I had never seen there before. She looked tired. Not the tiredness of a long day. The tiredness of a person who has been maintaining a structure for 22 years and has finally, in this quiet kitchen on a Saturday morning, been told she doesn't have to anymore. I did not feel triumphant walking out. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel the clean, bright rush that the word revenge implies. What I felt was much quieter than that. I felt the specific sensation of a sealed room finally opening, not warmth, not celebration, just air moving where air had not been moving before. Gerald was still in the garden. The scripture sign was above the door. I read it as I passed underneath it. I thought about the difference between building a life on something real and building it on something that requires constant maintenance. About which one is heavier to carry. I got in the car. The road back to Portland was clear. I turned the radio on for the first time in days, 14 days after I sat at my mother's kitchen table. Cedarwood Hospice. Fletcher's last night. Naira drove up from Salem in the afternoon. She arrived in a blue coat I had never seen before, carrying a paper bag of food she had packed for the drive and not touched. When I met her in the parking lot, she looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then she put both arms around me and held on. Naira, who deals with most difficult things by increasing the volume of herself, had gone very quiet in the 2 weeks since the morning phone call in the parking lot. Something had shifted in her. I recognized the shape of it because I felt it too. It was the particular rearrangement that happens when a story you have lived inside your whole life is taken apart, and you have to decide what to build in its place. We went inside together. Naira had already visited Fletcher 3 times over the past 10 days. I will not describe those conversations. Some things exist only for the people who were in the room for them, and the details of what a dying father and the daughter who didn't know him for 30 years say to each other in a hospice room belong entirely to the two of them. What I can tell you is that when I watched Naira come out of his room after the second visit, her eyes were wet and her chin was up, and she looked more like herself than she had looked in weeks. like something had been returned that she hadn't known she was missing. By the night I am describing, Fletcher was no longer conscious. His breathing had changed to the pattern I know well, the slow, irregular rhythm that indicates the final stage. It has a particular quality that is difficult to describe if you haven't heard it, but immediately recognizable once you have. It is not labored. It is simply intermittent, as if the body is remembering to breathe between other tasks that have become more pressing. Naira sat on his left side. I sat on his right. We each held one of his hands, on the windowsill behind us, the cedar jewelry box. I had spent 3 evenings on it over the past week. I had brought my own tools from home, a set I had bought specifically, having never owned woodworking tools before, and I had sat at the small table in the family room at Cedarwood and worked from Fletcher's pencil sketches, which I had unfolded and studied until I understood what he had intended. He had done the primary work, the joinery, the proportions, the basic structure of the box itself before he left Bend. What remained was the surface sanding, the fitting of the lid, and the installation of the small brass hinge he had already bought and kept in a paper bag in his bedside drawer. I am not a carpenter. I made mistakes. The lid sits slightly uneven on the left side where I misjudged the grain direction and took off too much material in one pass. It will never sit perfectly flush. There is a gap on the left edge when the lid is closed, just wide enough to feel with a fingertip. I decided not to fix it. I think, if Fletcher could have seen it, he would have found that funny. Not cruelly, warmly. The way a father finds it funny when his child tries something they were never taught and gets it mostly right. Fletcher took his last breath at 4:47 in the morning. It was a Tuesday. I noted that privately and said nothing about it. Some symmetries are for your own keeping. The room did what these rooms always do afterward. It became very still, very clear, with a quality of air that changes after a last breath in a way that is not dramatic, but is entirely unmistakable if you have been present for it enough times. Naira kept her hand on his for a long time. I kept mine too. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. We were both exactly where we should have been, doing the thing that had always been ours to do. We just hadn't known it was ours until now. Cale was in the corridor when we came out. He had been there since 3 in the morning. His shift had ended at 11 the night before. No one had called him. He was simply there, leaning against the wall beside the family room door with a coffee in each hand, and the quiet, unhurried presence of a person for whom showing up is not a decision that requires deliberation. He handed me a coffee. He looked at me in the way he looks at me, directly and without performance, not extracting, not interpreting, just seeing. Naira, who had never met Cale before that night and had heard me mention him approximately twice, looked between us for a moment. She is perceptive, Naira. She has always been the one in the room who notices what everyone else is working very hard to pretend is not there. She looked at him, then at me, then at him again. Then she said, in the voice she uses when she considers something to be obvious, a voice that carries considerably in a quiet hospice corridor at 5 in the morning. Oh, it was the first time I had laughed in 2 weeks. It came out sideways, the way laughter does when it arrives in the middle of something it shouldn't arrive in without warning, without permission, catching in the throat and coming out as something between a laugh and a breath. It surprised me completely, and it felt like something opening, a window. The same feeling as a sealed room getting air for the first time. Cale looked at Naira, then at me, and the corner of his mouth did a very specific thing. He did not say anything. He handed Naira her coffee with the same quiet deliberateness he brings to everything. I drove home at 6 in the morning as Portland came awake around me. The first commuters making their way in through the light that was not yet full light. The delivery trucks. The early dog walkers with their leashes and their takeaway cups. The city doing what cities do, resuming, unceremoniously, without pausing to acknowledge what the night had held. The cedar box was on my passenger seat, wrapped in a dish towel. The lid sat slightly uneven on the left side. I had considered going back in the last few days, refitting it, taking the time to do it properly. I had picked up the box more than once and held it and thought about the gap under the left edge, and every time I had put it back down exactly as it was. Because the gap under the left edge was mine. It was evidence of someone trying something they were never taught. Getting it mostly right, and choosing to keep the thing that was not perfect rather than take it apart again in pursuit of something flawless. I have taken enough things apart in my life in pursuit of flawless. I know where that habit leads. I grew up hating him. I want to say that plainly, one more time, before the end of this story. I spent 22 years absolutely certain that the hatred was making me stronger, that the walls I built from it were load-bearing, that the distance I kept from people who wanted to be close was a form of wisdom rather than a form of loss. What I know now, sitting in a car at 6 in the morning with an unfinished cedar box on my passenger seat and a heart that feels, for the first time in a very long time, like it has actual room in it, is that the hatred never made me strong. It just made me busy. It gave me something to carry so I wouldn't have to notice what I had set down. He gave me something better at the end. He gave me back the truth. And not only the truth about him, the truth about myself. About the difference between armor and ground. Between staying out of fear and choosing to stay because the person beside you is worth the staying. Naira is driving up to Portland next weekend with too much food and too many opinions about my apartment's lighting situation and zero intention of keeping either quiet. She already has a list of things she wants to change about my walls. The cedar box is on my nightstand. The lid sits slightly crooked on the left side. Cale Ashbourne is coming for dinner on Thursday. I have already established that he owns a proper coffee maker and has no strong opinions about the correct way to make pasta, which are, in my experience, the only two non-negotiable requirements for a functional human being. I spent 22 years learning to stay for strangers in the dark. I am just beginning, carefully, imperfectly, with the grain going the wrong direction in places, to learn to stay for myself. And I intend to do something worth doing with that, every single day, for as long as I have.